evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Happy Monday. Things are changing fast, as you know, and you can tell how fast they're changing by the way that people talk about politics. Language reflects feelings and thoughts. When your views change, so does the way you talk about them. And that's especially true of liberals who have very deep feelings. And their main feeling, this has always been true, is contempt for you. If you ever listen to NPR, you know exactly how much contempt liberals have for you, and you get to pay for it. NPR takes your tax dollars and then lectures you about how immoral you are. That is liberalism distilled. And it's been going on a long time. NPR has been running its particular scam since 1971, but the sneering tone you hear on NPR has been the hallmark of liberals for nearly a century. Liberals have contempt for Dwight Eisenhower and for Barry Goldwater and for Richard Nixon. Boy, did they. And for Gerald Ford, even. If you're old enough to remember Ronald Reagan, you will recall vividly how liberals felt about him. Reagan was an idiot, they told you, a mouth breather, and so was anybody who would vote for him, very much including you. In the words of Al Gore, Republicans were the, quote, extra chromosome right wing. So they were literally genetically defective. That's how liberals actually talk. Wherever two or more liberals are gathered, you will find sanctimony. But there's a new inflection. You may have noticed it recently. The pivot, and it was a pivot, came 6 years ago. It was during the 2016 presidential campaign. Liberals seemed to lose any remaining sense of humor the moment Donald Trump arrived. Why? Well, because he called their bluff. Looking back, it's obvious what happened. By 2016, no one could argue that liberal programs, or many programs, the various fads and metaphorical wars we were waging on this or that bad thing, there was no evidence that any of it had done anything to improve American life. Liberals promised you they would make everything great, but they didn't. In fact, every single liberal enthusiasm failed. From radical feminism to urban renewal, from outsourcing to the so-called sharing economy. All of them, each and every one, turned out to be a complete disaster. The reason 2016 was significant is that's the year liberals could no longer deny this. They couldn't say, give us another 50 years and we'll turn Baltimore into Geneva. They couldn't say that because no one would believe it. Not even their own voters would believe that. So for liberals, 2016 was a profoundly humiliating moment. And those can be good. Well-adjusted adults learn from humiliating moments. But that's not what liberals did. They turned their rage outward, and they focused that rage on the people they had failed. You always hate the ones you betray. So liberals decided they hated the American middle class. In 2016, Democrats stopped making arguments in favor of their own policies, whatever those might be, and instead reoriented the entire party around attacking the very people that historically they had represented. Again, America's middle class. Now they hated them. At a fundraiser she thought was off the record, Hillary Clinton summed up the contempt all of them felt. Listen.
You could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. Racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it.
A gaffe. Yeah, in the sense she was telling you exactly what she really thinks. She meant every word of that, and the applause that she received was heartfelt too. They all felt that way. And that's why 2016 was the year that you and everybody else became a racist. It was the worst slur they could think of. They used it every day of the 2016 campaign. Racist, racist, racist. Well, in the end, and they hated this above all, Donald Trump won more non-white votes than any Republican presidential candidate ever, but they didn't stop. No, they just increased the volume. And by 2020, a lot of Americans were just exhausted. Fine, we'll vote for a mannequin if only you will calm down. That was the unspoken yet very clear deal that liberals made with the country. If you ditch the orange man, we will stop screaming and burning your cities, and we can be all Americans again. So people voted for Biden. Maybe not 81 million, but some people did. But Democrats didn't mean it. By January of last year, the Democratic Party had more power than at any time since FDR was president. But the telling point, the tip-off, was they didn't seem happy about it. If anything, they seemed angrier than ever. Why? Because they had lost faith in their own program. They controlled everything, but they had no interest in making things better. They were no longer interested at all in social improvement. Social Security, they bragged about that for almost 100 years. They stopped talking about it. Head Start, remember that? Improving public schools. These were all liberal enthusiasms. They tried them all, and none of them worked. So they moved in the other direction. Instead of trying to fix the country, they decided to destroy the country and just start over. If you were watching from outside, it looked like they were having a fit. They erupted into uncontrollable nihilistic rage. They swept the plates off the table, punched a hole in the drywall, threw a vase through the TV. Burn it down. Let's start over. They called this the equity agenda. And you should have been nervous when you listened to them talk about it, because every time they talked about the equity agenda, they scowled. Joe Biden looked angry at his own inauguration. He had promised hope, but in the end, he delivered division and rage. This is Biden on the day he became president.
And now, a rise of political extremism, white supremacy, domestic terrorism that we must confront and we will defeat. Our history has been a constant struggle between the American ideal that we're all are created equal and the harsh, ugly reality that racism, nativism, fear, demonization have long torn us apart. The battle is perennial.
Huh? What was that? That wasn't the deal. We got rid of the orange man and you're still calling me racist? Why are you doing that? Why aren't you trying to unite the country? Why don't you win over the people who didn't vote for you? They didn't spend one day doing that. Instead, they moved in the opposite direction at high speed. They all of a sudden declared that trespassing was a felony and threw Trump voters in prison. A lot of them are still there. They said about politicizing the most heavily armed federal agencies, from the FBI to DHS to the Pentagon. That should make you nervous. And they did it for a reason, because they believed their political opponents were criminals. And you know that because they said so. They called them Nazis and white supremacists. You're not a Nazi or a white supremacist. Why are they calling you that? Why are they denouncing you as a seditionist, an enemy of the state? Why are they demanding that government censor and disarm you? Because they think you're a terrorist. They deployed thousands of National Guard troops to your capital and kept them there for months. What? Against Americans? We weren't being invaded. Those were Trump voters they claimed to be afraid of. They began using language that even the most radical Democrat in Congress just 6 years ago would have thought was way too extreme. And it wasn't just a few of them who did this. Virtually all of them did it.
Certain dates echo throughout history. December 7th, 1941. September 11th, 2001. And January 6th, 2021.
Similar to Pearl Harbor and 9/11.
We can now add January 6th, 2021 to that very short list of dates in American history that will live forever in infamy.
The worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War.
The worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War.
And this was the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War.
The worst single act of political violence since the Civil War.
The worst attack on American democracy, arguably, probably since the Civil War.
The 1/6 attacks are likely to kill a lot more Americans than were killed on the 9/11 attacks.
January 6th was worse than 9/11.
Why are they talking like that? It's so obviously untrue, and yet they're all reading from the same script. There has to be a purpose here. They're not doing this accidentally. People don't use identical chunks of language on the same day by accident. They thought this through. And then they began putting people on television whose only qualification was their willingness to say things that, again, 3 years ago would have been considered beyond the pale. And not just a few of them, a lot of them. Here's a former Trump administration lackey telling you with a straight face that the Republican Party is a bigger threat to this nation than al-Qaeda or ISIS.
Radicalized elements of the Republican Party now represent a bigger threat to our democracy than organizations like al-Qaeda or ISIS ever did. Now, not necessarily to human lives, not necessarily, but a bigger threat to our democracy than those terrorist groups ever did.
So why are they talking this way? Well, what else are they going to talk about? Their record in Detroit for the last 60 years? No. The Democratic Party decided the only way it could maintain power, win the next election, is to convince you, the voter, that the other side is dangerous, literally dangerous, not metaphorically dangerous, actually dangerous to your life. The problem is you have to up the ante in every election. If they're white supremacists this election, what are they next election? Nazis, and then what? John Brennan, the former CIA director, said he looked forward to an authoritarian crackdown. You'll notice he lumps in libertarians with fascists, bigots, and racists. Watch this.
Looking forward that the members of the Biden team who have been nominated or have been appointed are now moving in laser-like fashion to try to uncover as much as they can about what looks very similar to insurgency movements that we've seen overseas, where they germinate in different parts of the country and they gain strength, and it brings together an unholy alliance frequently of religious extremists, authoritarians, fascists, bigots, racists, nativists, even libertarians.
That was the month that Joe Biden was inaugurated. The month you'd think liberals like John Brennan would be celebrating Trump's departure. But again, they were angrier than ever, and they've gotten angrier since that day. So where's this going? Well, it's going the only place it ever could go. Democrats have reached the logical end of name-calling. Why? Because they've run out of epithets. Once you've accused your political opponents of being Nazis, white supremacists, and then of treason, you have reached the limits of language. When you're dealing with someone who's committed treason, it is now a law enforcement matter. People are going to have to be physically punished. So not surprisingly, that is what they are now calling for. Arrest them! All of a sudden, you're hearing a lot of liberals say that. Not just the crazies, but the mainstream people. Willard Mitt Romney, a man who's probably never used the F word in his entire life, is suddenly accusing Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, one of the most reasonable people ever to serve in the body, of treason. Not accusing her of being mistaken or wrong, but accusing her of betraying her country even as she serves it in uniform. What's the penalty for that? Well, it's prison, at least. Watch.
Tulsi Gabbard is being accused of spreading Russian false flag propaganda.
And I think DOJ, in the same way that it is setting up a task force to investigate oligarchs, should look into people who are Russian propagandists and shilling for Putin.
They used to arrest people for doing stuff like this. If they thought you were colluding with a Russian agent, if they thought you were putting out information or taking information and handing over to Russia, they used to actually investigate stuff like this. And I guess now, you know, there seems to be no bars.
Yeah, it's The View. They're harpies. They're ridiculous. They're stupid. All true. But what was so surprising is that that wasn't even considered much of a news story. It's that common. A liberal fundraising group called Call to Action is now demanding the arrest of Clarence Thomas's wife, Ginny Thomas, someone who, as far as we know, hasn't done anything wrong apart from marrying a man that liberals don't like. So even 5 years ago, if some liberal group was raising money on the idea Ginny Thomas should be arrested because she's married to Clarence Thomas, that would have seemed demented. Now it's just another cable news segment. A lot of them are like that. Here's former Fox reporter Carl Cameron on CNN this weekend calling for us, this show, to be sent to prison because that's now the fair penalty for disagreeing with Joe Biden. Jail time. And the host of the show on CNN seems to think that sounds about right.
In this particular case, Tucker has been screaming fire in a crowded movie house for years. And that cliche really comes to the matter of what is free speech. And the fact of the matter is, if you disturb the peace by starting a riot in a movie theater, cops are going to arrest you and you might end up in jail or you might end up in something worse. And that kind of stuff absolutely has to stop, whether it's the antitrust bill to take down and deplatform people who lie and put out falsehoods that cause damage and violent hate. There ought to be something done about it. And the administration is beginning to actually make a move on that. And it's been way overdue.
The administration is beginning to make a move on that, says the journalist. Maybe wind up in jail or maybe something worse, quote. Well, what's something worse? Well, we're not sure what something worse is, but it certainly feels like we're moving toward it at very high speed at this point. That's the end point to talk like that, something worse. Because rhetoric has its own internal logic. You've experienced it. You can talk yourself into things. We've all done that. Democrats are doing it right now. And what they're talking themselves into right now is, quote, something worse. It's scary. It is time to pull back. It is time to de-escalate. Otherwise, this is going to get really ugly really soon. Subscribe to the Fox News YouTube channel to catch our nightly opens, stories that are changing the world and changing your life. From Tucker Carlson Tonight.